Many folks on this roundtable have been working in and around headless content management systems for a while, and there's been a lot of growth over the last few years in headless. Has that demand begun to slow down? And if so, why? What's behind that? Where are we at with headless demand? Nicole, I'd like to start with you, and if you could pass the ball to Mark and then Michael.
Great, happy to. It is an interesting moment. We have a couple of things happening simultaneously. I mean, one is the broader set of economic circumstances we find ourselves in, concerns about recession, job trends, whether it's employment or stagnation of employment. These things, I think, are factors that we can't really take out of the picture because they're influencing the way companies think about the investments that they're making. And unsurprisingly, uncertainty means a lot of businesses are trying to be a little bit more cautious, more conservative in how and where they choose to invest. So I think that's the backdrop to what has also happened, which is we have this fairly new still technology shift around headless technologies, composability, if you will, as it is, I think, more increasingly being described and probably with some good reason. More and more providers of these technologies, more and more businesses are interested in them. But what we've moved from is an environment where we have the real advocates of this who are the early adopters who understand it pretty innately and are quick to adopt, into an environment where we're now seeing larger organizations who are dealing with frankly, a larger degree of complexity. And so what we're seeing is this natural evolution of the technology itself really starting to get to a scale in the market, but also a scale in terms of the organizational size of companies adopting it, where that complexity is coming to the fore. And you've got different organizations, different teams, different skill sets, different stakeholders within any one organization of significant size that all have a vested interest in this. It makes decisions a lot more challenging. It makes the kind of dynamic around who decides, who's in the driver's seat on these decisions, more challenging and often less consistent. And it also means that from a vendor standpoint, we have to really know and understand all these different stakeholders and their needs and be able to anticipate and meet them effectively. And that's a whole different scale of design challenge as we think about our product roadmap. So there's a lot there to unpack. Michael, I'm going to toss this one over to you because I know you've got some perspectives on how we got to here and what that means.
Yeah, sure. So I think we've seen actually some incredible achievements really in how the market has developed, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. I mean, I remember talking a number of years ago about headless as an approach, and people outside of the developer community had no idea what I was talking about at all. And now, I talk to content folks, and a lot of people are familiar with headless. They're interested in it. Their organizations may be adopting it, at least in pockets of their organization. So headless has actually become a bit mainstream. That doesn't mean it's pervasive everywhere, but it definitely has become accepted in organizations. What we have, though, I think are several things, and I agree with really everything Nicole just said, but one of the things is that we had a lot of IT spending during the pandemic because everything had to shift online. Everyone wanted to do everything in the cloud, and there was a binge of IT spending. And this was not just for content, it was just for every kind of IT technology that was needed to support employees and customers. And I think organizations now, as they sort of look and are trying to figure out what's going to happen next in the economy, they're really trying to find value from what they're spending on. They can't just spend and try to figure out the value as they go along. They really want to understand the value they're going to get from what they're doing. So they're trying to be much more coherent in how they're spending things rather than just having different pockets of the organization all spending on their own. So we saw a lot of things where shifts to, say, no-code type tools and things like that, and everyone's sort of just doing their own thing. And now everyone's sort of having a rethink. And how do we get all this stuff to work together? So composability, which is really about giving IT customers and enterprises the option to sort of choose from what types of tools would meet their needs, is a really good way for them to realize value, but they need to make sure that all these different things work together. And so that's, I think, one of the key things that's starting to happen right now, just where the market is. And then we, of course, have these new events like the whole generative AI explosion. And I will probably talk a bit more about that in a moment. But one of the key things is that pretty much all big enterprises are definitely putting money into this. They're trying to figure out what they can do with it, but they are spending money on that. So I think that's going to be part of the growth in the future. But I'm curious what Mark thinks about this, because I know he has a lot of perspectives on how these different pieces fit together and need to fit together.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I want to do is also just put like the regular business hat on, because I think a lot of what we're seeing trend-wise is fairly typical in a new market. And certainly if you look at Headless, the adoption, I think, is very much a typical S-curve. In the early days, Headless systems didn't even have things like preview, for example. And so, adoption was really, really low. And then all of a sudden, functionally, you get to things that really enable developers. So, really good CI/CD processes, really solid APIs, good tooling around all of that. And developers thought, oh my God, this is great. And it's addressing their needs in a way that DXPs weren't. And that's when you saw that massive adoption curve. And I think what's happening now is vendors have kind of tapped out that market. And so that adoption starts to slow, and you start to get to organizations now that no longer kind of inherently understand the advantages of these approaches. And so we're now at this point where vendors kind of need to decide, what they want to do. And, previously they were targeting developers really effectively. And now it is that crossing the chasm moment of, okay, this technology is going to start to become more mainstream. And the big question that nobody really has a good answer to is, what does mainstream look like? What does the typical marketer look like? And that's hard, because often there isn't a typical marketer. And, to Michael's point as well, throw generative AI into the mix, and that's going to change things that we haven't previously considered. Previously, we were managing individual content items, and now there's going to be much more content that you're managing sort of as a set. There's a lot of complex governance that you might be having to apply to this. And so, we're kind of, from a vendor perspective and from a buyer perspective, really entering the unknown. And I think that unknown as well is, not just on the, customer side and the economics and that buying cycle there, but also on the vendor side. While they start to figure that out, and there will be some early moves and some early missteps, and that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to do a quick summary and then ask Larry for some perspective on the way that this is being within the various parts of the content industry. Larry gets to speak with a lot of folks from different perspectives within the content industry, and has bridged to a lot of this IT and UX conversation that Mark is beginning to hint at as well. So I'm hearing that there's complexity that is being perceived within the market, and there's market education that has been successful enough to gain adoption. As Michael has pointed out, significant adoption. We've been talking about content as a service for 12 years, and it's amazing how it went from a backwater idea to something that has been, an industry-wide phenomenon as Headless and content APIs and the delivery of content objects via queries has been massively uptaken within the enterprise, especially within IT. And as Mark is pointing out, this massive technology sponsorship that has powered that growth, but now it's reaching into other parts of the enterprise. And there is where I think the complexity that Nicole talked about, people are navigating, and the shifting roles are coming into play. So it's essentially like there's a realization of the differences from traditional monolithic, all-in-one systems, and what a service-oriented environment and architecture does to content that has been recognized primarily within IT buyers. And now there's a need to kind of shift that into the business. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're getting to a lot of the nuance there too, right? I mean, we talk about an IT buyer, but we're not even talking about all IT buyers. And in fact, in some cases, we're talking about development teams within a marketing organization. I mean, it gets very sliced and diced. Is there a digital organization within the business? That tends to be the center of gravity for a lot of this stuff. So there is a tremendous amount of nuance, which I think we started getting to in this idea of there being this higher degree of complexity and this broader set of stakeholders that are actually involved as we start hitting that next level of maturity in both the technology and the way it's being adopted.
So content services are important to the enterprise, and the people that have gotten that so far have generally been IT, where they're used to service-oriented data environments, for example. So service-oriented content makes sense. Now it's got to make sense to the marketers, and it's got to make sense to the folks who are in user experience, and there's some gaps there. And Larry, you spent some time exploring those gaps, and love to hear your reflections on what you've seen in the uptake of Headless and where you see the headwinds in Headless are.
Well, the headwinds to me are, one of them is really obvious. Like if you look at any of these headless CMS vendors, they all have like huge DevRel teams, developer relations folks out there talking to folks. And Michael was at content.ia. Sanity has Carrie Hain. HighGraph has Lo Etheridge. I think that's it for the whole rest of the user base of these CMSs. So, and that's a generic criticism that people like Greg Dunlap and Dean Barker levy all the time at CMSs. The reason people hate their CMS is because there's been no attention paid to the authoring environment. So I kind of like increasingly identify as a service designer. In big enterprises, there's just this increasing need for sophisticated content usage of this technology, but you need to have that input. This is kind of where service design, enterprise UX, and all those IT buying decisions, I think, need to come together if we're really going to step into the future. And I think that's the kind of stuff that all the folks on this panel, we're all nodding, we see it clearly. I'm struggling with how to get that message more broadly adopted and understood.